что ж, с возвращением в мой канал. No, I'm not going to do the entire video in Russian, but that would be fun, right? Hi, it's been a long time. So, I recently remembered that the movie Anastasia exists, and because of Disney's non-stop journey to gobble up every media property that exists, I found it on Disney+. So I watched it, and wow, it's not as good as I remember it being. To be fair, I'm a bit biased here. I was a Russian major in college, horrible decision, don't recommend it. But because of that, I have a baseline knowledge of Russian history. That's not to say I'm an expert at it, so don't quote me on that. But I do have a fascination with the Romanovs and the beginnings of the Soviet Union, which is when the movie is set. So I wanted to talk about it. This is an obscure and random topic that has little to nothing to do with my last video. What the hell is this about? Side note, thank you for getting that video to 1.3 million views. How the hell did that happen? But I thought, since I know some stuff about Russian history, and since I know some stuff about film, why not combine those and make a video where there's no chance that I'll get anything wrong? But I actually do find Anastasia really interesting because of just how historically revisionist it is. Now, I have no problem with media being historically inaccurate as long as it tells a good story. But I think there is something big to critique with the specific way that Anastasia revises history. And it also doesn't tell a good story, so it's not exempt. A few things, first of which is this. In Russian, Anastasia is pronounced Anastasia, but for simplicity's sakes, I'll be using the anglicized pronunciation, just so you're aware. Also, if you loved this movie, or still love this movie, this video is not meant to tell you that you are not allowed to enjoy that movie. I'm just simply trying to explore the implications and ramifications of the movie. This is also going to get nitpicky at times, not because I think they are inherent problems with the movie, but because I think they're funny, and I want to provide some Russian cultural knowledge. I also want to say that the first half or so of this video is going to be mostly uncontroversial. We're going to be talking about fun stuff, analyzing the quality of the movie, that kind of stuff. But then the second half of the video does get quite heavy with the things I will discuss, so I will put content warnings when they apply. So just be warned. This video is probably going to get like 500 views. Who wants to hear about Anastasia in 1997? Just me. Well, let's get started. Anastasia, directed by Don Bluth and released in 1997 by Fox Animation Studios, which also directed Titan A.E. and The Prince of Egypt, so you know we're in good company, stars Meg Ryan and John Cusack. It tells the story of the Grand Duchess of Russia and the youngest daughter of the last Tsar of Russia, Nikolas II, Anastasia Nikolaevna. It's based on rumors that Anastasia survived her execution in 1918 and just disappeared. For the record, Anastasia did die in 1918, which is very sad, but all the rumors and myths about her survival are untrue. I don't know why I said that, like it's not common knowledge at this point. But anyway, I'm just going to run through the plot of this movie really quickly to get everybody caught up. Yes, you could read a synopsis on Wikipedia, but I'm trying to make this bullshit as long as possible, so I need to pad the runtime. In 1916 in St. Petersburg, at a party hosted by the Romanovs, Rasputin arrives to curse the Romanov family. Not long after, the Russian Revolution begins and sends the Romanovs into exile. The Dowager Empress Maria, Anastasia's grandmother, escapes while Anastasia is knocked out and left behind in St. Petersburg. 10 years later, just before the Russian Industrial Revolution, rumors have spread that Anastasia is still alive and the Dowager Empress has offered a reward for her return. Anastasia, now called Anya, is now 18 and an amnesiac, having no recollection of her life before the Russian Revolution. She journeys to St. Petersburg to try to travel to Paris based on a locket she keeps that says "Together in Paris." After being denied a ticket, Anastasia approaches a man named Dmitri and his accomplice Vladimir, who are after the reward for Anastasia's return. And due to her resemblance to the Grand Duchess, Dmitri offers to take her to Paris. Meanwhile, Rasputin, presumed dead, exists in limbo and is awakened by Anastasia's return. Determined to kill her in order to restore his life, he orchestrates various ways in order to do that, such as hijacking a train or getting her to sleepwalk off of a boat. Along the way, Anastasia starts to remember her life, and she and Dmitri begin to fall in love. Once in Paris, they struggle to orchestrate a conversation with the Dowager Empress due to her frustration with a number of scams. At this point, Dmitri has figured out that Anastasia is the Grand Duchess, and does anything in his power to arrange a meeting. They eventually do speak, and the Dowager Empress soon realizes that she is Anastasia. Dmitri leaves soon after due to his guilt and due to the now wide class difference between him and Anastasia. At a ball, Anastasia is attacked by Rasputin and almost thrown off a bridge before Dmitri returns to fight him. Anastasia eventually sends Rasputin to presumably hell. Anastasia and Dmitri elope, leaving a note to the Dowager Empress. She has now found a home in her grandmother and with her new husband. The end. Let's talk about Don Bluth is the director of Anastasia and Mitt Romney's cousin. I'm not kidding. You've probably seen some of his movies. The Secret of NIMH, An American Tale, The Land Before Time, All Dogs Go to Heaven, and the title of this video, Anastasia, are among his highest grossing movies. But he'd been working in animation for a very long time. He worked at Disney for many years and helped animate some of their films, including Sleeping Beauty, Robin Hood, The Rescuers, and Pete's Dragon. He even created the arcade game Dragon's Lair, which has been described as one of the best video games of all time. After animating a few scenes for Fox and the Hound, however, he left Disney because he had become disillusioned with the way that the company was run. He and several other animators at Disney left to form their own studio, Don Bluth Productions, which produced many of the films listed before. They started off well enough with The Secret of NIMH, which was a critical success, though only earning $12 million, which most blame on the poor promotion. Because of this, they were in financial trouble and had to declare bankruptcy a few times. Luckily, a broker named Morris Sullivan saw potential in the studio and helped to finance it, helping them with business and helping them find a new studio. The studio was renamed Sullivan Bluth Studios. God, I'm sweating in this outfit. These probably don't help. Not long after this, Steven Spielberg approached Bluth about making a movie together in collaboration with his own animation studio, Amblin Entertainment. Around the same time, the studio moved to Dublin. This collaboration with Spielberg resulted in An American Tale and The Land Before Time, both of which were critically acclaimed and grossed over $80 million. So they're doing amazing. 3 critically acclaimed and mostly commercially successful movies under their belt. They've got support from Steven Spielberg. But you know, what goes up must come down. There's a sex joke in there somewhere, I'm just too lazy to figure it out. Their follow-up to The Land Before Time was All Dogs Go to Heaven, which was released in competition with The Little Mermaid, and we all know how The Little Mermaid went. All Dogs Go to Heaven did okay, but it also received mixed reviews from critics, making it their first movie not to be a critical success. This was followed by Rockadoodle, Thumbelina, Misty Canyon, A Troll in Central Park, and A Pebble and a Penguin. Did you even notice I made one of those up? Every single one of these movies tanked and received negative reviews from critics. With the studio on the decline and with Bluth having limited options, he agreed to head up the new Fox Animation Studios in Phoenix, and Sullivan Bluth Studios shut down. It was through Fox Animation Studios that Bluth released Anastasia and later Titan AE. Anastasia was considered a return to form for Don Bluth, and it made Fox Animation Studios a legitimate competitor of Disney. There was also a prequel to Anastasia titled Bartok the Magnificent, which I really wanted to talk about in this, but since it's already going to be over an hour long, I decided against it. Maybe a future video. And while sequels of Bluth's films have been made in the past, this was the first one that he was directly involved in. Unfortunately, this success would not last long, and their follow-up, Titan AE, was a massive box office bomb and received mixed reviews from critics, which ended up leading to the shutdown of Fox Animation Studios. While it's impossible to get into the animation business without at some point being compared to Disney, Sullivan Bluth Studios and Don Bluth's work as a whole was specifically made to be a competitor of Disney. Don Bluth left Disney because he was tired of the studio favoring technical innovation over telling good stories. Funnily enough, the first film that Disney released following Don Bluth's departure was The Black Cauldron, which was criticized for favoring technical advancement over telling a good story. His departure caused a huge stir, with around 17% of Disney's animation department leaving with him. So here's the reason why I feel the need to discuss Don Bluth when talking about Anastasia. Bluth's entire career post-Disney was based off of spite. And I'm not saying that is an inherent negative, but that is really what it feels like. So his first few movies, The Secret of NIMH, An American Tale, The Land Before Time, and even All Dogs Go to Heaven to an extent, were specifically not like Disney. They had heavy themes, classic animation, complex characters, dark storylines. And then he had this string of critical and commercial failures and had to shut down his studio. And his first film back when he started at Fox Animation Studios was Anastasia, which pretty much everyone I have ever talked to said that at some point they thought it was a Disney movie. There's something I find kind of tragic about all of this. He spent all this time trying to be a different animator than he was at Disney, only to return to a Disney formula eventually. Now, I'm not going to speculate and try to figure out why he did this. I just think it's interesting to note how derivative Anastasia is of Disney. Anastasia is a romance and a musical. We have this young, spunky, beautiful protagonist who is of royal blood, but her parents are dead. She has an animal sidekick, there's heavy use of magic, there's a comic relief character that doesn't really work, she gets married quickly, even the animation style is very similar to Disney. These are all such common tropes in Disney movies, and Anastasia follows them to a T. And it is not inherently bad that Anastasia is Don Bluth's most Disney-like project. Disney has a formula that works, and Don Bluth obviously knew this from his tenure at Disney. But then, for his next movie, Tiny, he did something so completely different from what Disney had ever done, and it failed tremendously to the point that Fox Animation had to shut down. And it was also the last movie that Don Bluth has ever directed. The competition when Tiny was released wasn't even very strong either. It finished 5th in its first weekend behind Shaft, Gone in 60 Seconds, Big Mama's House, and Mission Impossible 2. Now, I'm not going to try to defend Tiny because it's not a good movie, but I do find it kind of sad how different and innovative it was for animation, and for it to fail just as hard as it did. It's also sad because this basically just destroyed one of Disney's only competitors. And now, Anastasia, one of Don Bluth's most commercially successful, critically acclaimed, beloved, and remembered movies, is on Disney+. So this section of the video is going to be all the little nitpicks I have with the movie. To reiterate the beginning, I don't bring these up because I think they are inherent problems with the movie. I just think they're funny. I'm not trying to cinema sense this bitch. Can somebody tell me why the gates of the Winter Palace have an E on them? That's what the weird backwards end looking character is. Because I genuinely don't know. Why does this movie start in 1916? Because the February Revolution was in 1917. And even if we give it the benefit of the doubt that this is in late December, in this scene, Rasputin clearly says fortnight.
Within a fortnight!
Meaning the February Revolution would have taken place in mid-January at the latest, when it took place in late February. At the time of the February Revolution, Anastasia would have been 15, not 8 as she is depicted here. And I'm genuinely confused as to what the creative decision to age her down was. The only thing I can think was to emphasize her innocence. I don't know. The accent of the guy playing Nikolas is really funny.
You are a traitor! Get out!
So I'll get into the problems with the way this movie depicts Rasputin later, but the idea that Rasputin would ever sell his soul is frankly ludicrous. He was not a good person, he was completely delusional, but he always prided himself on being a holy man. So he wouldn't just give that up. Why does this movie act like Rasputin had any special vindictiveness towards Anastasia? There's little to no evidence of whether or not they interacted, let alone how they interacted. Also this. So in this movie, Anastasia's grandmother is returning to Paris. Here's the thing though, the Dowager Empress was Danish by birth. So after the February Revolution, she returned to Denmark, not Paris. But honestly, I'm kind of in support of this decision because we can't have people thinking that Denmark is an actual place, so good on Fox. Never thought I'd say that sentence. In what world would a fall like this cause amnesia? It doesn't even look like she hit her head that hard. This one is less egregious overall because Hollywood just thinks it's so easy to become afflicted with amnesia, so this transition gets me every time.
I never saw her again.
I think it's just the fact that the monologue is so morbid and then very suddenly it's this triumphant music. I don't know, the juxtaposition is just funny. This is the stupidest nitpick here. So the church depicted here is the Church of Savior on Spilled Blood. Now, that is a tall building, no doubt, but it is nowhere near tall enough to break the cloud cover. It's like 300 feet. I understand the stylistic choice and what it says about the industrialization of Russia. We'll get to that, but I just think the visual is very comical. At this time, the city would not have been called... At the beginning of the movie, before the Russian Revolution, it would have been called Petrograd. After the February Revolution, the beginning of the Soviet Union, which most of the movie takes place in, it would have been called Leningrad. Now, this is another stupid nitpick because I'm calling it St. Petersburg. I don't know all the rules about the word, but I highly doubt that the orphanage owner would be called Comrade. Comrade usually implies like a friendly or cordial relationship between two people of basically equal status, and the orphanage owner is in a position of power, so I very much doubt that she would be called Comrade. Also, her name is Flemenkov, which is not a Russian name by any stretch, it's just the word phlegm made all Slavic and fun. She names this dog she finds Puka, which is a cute name, don't get me wrong. But as far as I can tell, that is not a usual Russian pet name. But I do have two ideas of where this name could have come from, one more plausible than the other. The first one is that there is a Celtic god named Puka, and the only reason I bring that up is because I found it on Russian Wikipedia. The other, more plausible one is that there is a Russian word puk, which is a more colloquial and somewhat profane way to say fart. Do these demon things just kill the conductor? Is that canonical? So I understand the use of Cyrillic letters mixed with Latin letters to make things feel all, Slavic or whatever. But because I can read Russian, this speedometer just breaks my brain. So assuming that the E, the P, and the T are all the Latin equivalents, which there are Russian letters that look similar, that leaves us with the letters representing D, M, and R, which in Russian sound like F, Sha, and Ya, respectively. So if we're reading this phonetically, it would read something like Spifoshatia, and that's the only thing I can read the speedometer as. Nobody who doesn't read Cyrillic would ever think of this, but me and my Russian degree do. Sophie and Vladimir's names make no sense. Sophie's full name is Sophie Stanislavskievna Samorkov Smirnov. So first off, Sophie is not a Russian name. It would most likely be Sophia. Second, her patronymic is Stanislavskievna. Now, a patronymic is a thing in Russian culture and other cultures. One of your names derived from usually the first name of your father. But the problem is that Stanislavski, which is the name that this patronymic is derived from, is a surname, and that doesn't make sense. So that, and then hyphenated last names are not really a thing in Russia. I don't know if that's a thing that happens more in modern Russia, but it wouldn't be in 1928. No, 1927. Her name would either be Samorkov or Smirnov, or more likely Samorkova or Smirnova, because Russian last names are often gendered. Vladimir's full name is Vladimir Vanya Vainitsky Vasilovich. First name is fine, but Vanya is a nickname for Ivan, so that would never be his middle name. Now, I know that Vanya Vainitsky is a reference to the play Uncle Vanya, where Vanya Vainitsky is the titular character. It's the second time he's referenced in this movie, and I'm not really sure why. It still bothers me. Vasilovich is presented as his last name, when that is a patronymic based on the name Vasily, so it should be his middle name. Nobody who doesn't know Russian would notice this, but it frustrates me. They just straight up strapped a dagger to this dog. I just think that's funny. So to reiterate, these nitpicks are included not because I think there are inherent problems with the movie, but because I think they're funny, or I just wanted to provide some Russian cultural knowledge. None of them mean that the movie is bad, because the movie is not bad. Kind of. We'll get to it. But now it's time to get to the meat of the video. So this is the part of the video where I actually analyze the quality of the movie. So first off, the animation is absolutely incredible, particularly in the beginning with the ball and the Paris holds the key sequence. It's clear that the animators were really trying, and I really have to hand it to them for making almost every scene of this movie pop. The pace of this movie is also really well done and streamlined. You can say a lot of things about the movie, which I will, but boring is not one of them. There's almost always something exciting happening, whether it's plot or character related. The tone is for the most part solid. While there are dark moments to the story, it doesn't really take itself too seriously, so the comedy aspects don't feel too jarring. We'll get to you, you son of a bitch. And the music is almost uniformly great, particularly Journey to the Past and Once Upon a December. But then I'm not really an expert in music theory or scoring, so don't take that one as super objective. So there are other aspects of this movie that I like, but they're mostly minuscule to the point that they're completely inconsequential to the overall movie. So I'm going to get into my criticisms of the movie, which are more comprehensive, so if you loved or still love this movie, just be warned, I am going to rip it a new one. Let's start with one of the more simple critiques, the voice cast. When this movie was released, one of the aspects of the movie that was praised by a lot of people was the performances of the cast, which I don't really agree with. Meg Ryan in the lead role was a weird choice. I read from multiple sites that Meg Ryan was Don Bluth's first and basically only choice to play Anastasia, and to an extent, I get it. Anastasia is meant to be this spunky, carefree, joie de vivre character, and Meg Ryan definitely fits that type. But the problem is that Meg Ryan was in her 30s playing an 18-year-old. Now, for voice work in particular, I don't generally have a problem with the age of the character being different from the age of the actor. But the thing is that Meg Ryan wasn't really a seasoned voice actress. She'd done Captain Planet for a couple years, and that was about it. And voice acting is very different from on-camera acting, because on camera you can convey your character through subtle nuances, your facial expressions, your physicality, etc. Whereas with voice work, you kind of have to convey all of that through your voice alone, and that's pretty hard to do. While Meg Ryan is a good actress, if not super versatile, her performance as Anastasia feels less like an 18-year-old trying to navigate life and more like a woman in her late 20s figuring out how to close a business deal.
What are you circling me? What were you, a vulture in another life?
For the record, I do have the exact same complaints about John Cusack as Dimitri, and he also doesn't have the charisma to play the lovable asshole trope well, though that may have been the writing.
Yeah, I hate that woman.
Kelsey Grammer's Vladimir is okay. I don't really have many comments about his performance. He's kind of forgettable. I feel like I should love Christopher Lloyd's performance as Rasputin. His performance is flamboyant and hammy, and those are my favorite types of villains. I'm personally pro queer coding, and I still don't really know exactly why it doesn't work for me, but I have a theory. I think, and hear me out on this, I don't think he is queer coded enough. When you look at Disney villains like Ursula or Scar, they're not only hammy, they have queer signifiers. This is the essence of queer coding, and while queer coding in general is morally a mixed bag, I personally think that is what got us some of the best villains, and I think we should bring that back, or just make the villains explicitly queer. I think that's an option too. I think there is something to be said about the specific energy that queer-coded villains bring to a movie. There's little to no nuance, they're having the time of their life, and they're being queer while doing it. What's not to love? That's not the point. The point is that Christopher Lloyd's performance as Rasputin feels over the top and hammy, but it doesn't feel queer. This is probably my most subjective complaint here, because a villain does not need to be queer-coded to be good, but I just feel like his performance is lacking. Though that might have been the writing, but we'll get to that. I love Hank Azaria so much. I think he's a phenomenal actor who doesn't get enough credit for his work. His performance as Bartok was not it. I remember when I was younger, I loved Bartok. I thought he was so funny because his dry humor contrasted with Rasputin's over-the-top dramatic humor. But as an adult, the choice that Hank Azaria made with Bartok's voice is just so confounding to me. In an interview, he stated that when he was presenting the voice that most people didn't understand it but eventually warmed up to it. I think in a different movie the performance could have worked, but with this movie, with this tone, he just stands out, and very much not in a good way. I kind of hate you, actually. God, you're annoying. Alright, Angela Lansbury probably has the best performance. Her accent's not the best, but she actually feels like a loving and concerned grandma, which, that's what the role is, so. Alright, that's performances. Now let's talk about characterization, particularly Anastasia's. Anastasia's not that great of a character. She has the makings of a good protagonist, a definable character, infectious energy, a clear want, but where she is lacking is a need. This isn't like a closely guarded secret or anything, but in storytelling, there's the concept of want versus need, and most well-written characters have both. So an external want is just something the character desires, whether it be love, family, a home, a McRib, whatever. And then there's also an internal need, which is a little bit harder to define, but it usually relates back to the theme of the movie. Like a big one is forgiveness, like the character needs to forgive someone or themselves or whatever. So we know what Anastasia wants. She wants to find a home, but what does she need? Does she need to find a family in who she already has? If so, the choice to have the Dowager Empress accept her and reintegrate her kind of conflicts with that. One thing I think is a big problem is that her conflict completely changes once she reunites with her grandmother. Before, her conflict was her struggle to remember her past and her desire to find a family. But once she reunites with her grandmother, that's fixed. But we still have about 20 minutes until the climax of the movie, so we need to introduce a new conflict. So for about 10 minutes, the movie introduces a new conflict, which is Anastasia being uncomfortable with aristocracy. And I don't want to say that this is explicitly a bad thing. Having multiple conflicts for a character to go through is not bad. It happens in a lot of movies. But the problem is that her struggle with what aristocracy means was never established. Before the scene where her grandmother gives her the choice to walk away, her relationship to aristocracy is never explained. She never has to contend with what aristocracy means. There's also little weight given to the fact that being part of aristocracy means having to be separated from Dmitri. So it's not like she can contend with that until now. So this whole part just feels tacked on and relatively unimportant. All this brings us back to the question of what does Anastasia need? Because I genuinely don't know. The one thing I can think is that she needs to follow her heart, but the one time her following her heart is ever put into question is in the scene I hate that I just described. So Anastasia's need is not established or reinforced to the point that it's basically impossible to tell what it is supposed to be. But that's not an inherent problem with the narrative, ? I recently rewatched Lindsay Ellis's video on The Little Mermaid, and she brings up the fact that Ariel is not the main character. She's the point of view character, but she's not the protagonist. Triton is, because he's the one who has the most significant character arc. And I think a similar thing is happening here. In terms of who has the most character development, and whose character development ties into the themes of the movie, it's not Anastasia, it's Dmitri. So Dmitri has a clear want and need. He wants to get the reward by duping the Dowager Empress, but he needs to learn to genuinely care about people. And this is actually really good because these two ideas conflict with each other, which is not necessary for good storytelling, but it just adds to the drama. And his character arc fits more neatly into the, I think, more accurate theme of the movie, which is learning to care about others. So it isn't necessarily bad that the point of view character isn't the most developed character, but this movie builds up Anastasia to be the main character through her personality and her writing, but then can't sell it with her development. And I'm definitely overthinking this, but it just doesn't work for me. I think that the romance was meant to be the main plot of the movie. It is the aspect of the movie that is most reinforced by the plot, but, between all these plot points, they forgot to give them bonding moments. In the scene on the boat when they're dancing and they almost kiss, the filmmakers clearly want us to buy that these two characters are falling in love, and I don't buy it. There are moments where they bond, like this one. And this one. Oh, when Dmitri finds out she's the Grand Duchess, he actually puts her needs before his, but still had to find out she was the Grand Duchess in order for him to make that choice. This scene just feels tacked on, and we're meant to believe they're falling in love because Vladimir says they are.
An unspoken attraction.
Attraction?
I'm all for enemies to lovers, but I do really hate the trope that because two characters bicker or argue that they're attracted to each other. Don't have time to get into that. Shivers me timbers. The purpose of a villain is to oppose a hero. That much is obvious. But what's not really discussed as much is how this relates to character development. A villain challenges a hero's ideas and can either make them question their ideas or reinforce their belief in those ideas. I mean, there are other options, gray areas, whatever, but just keep it simple, In this regard, does Rasputin work as a villain? Because in the movie, Anastasia and Rasputin have two direct interactions. One is when she's a child and he tries to drown her. And the second is when she's an adult and he tries to drown her. And both times he dies. God, my dude can't catch a break. Anastasia has no idea that Rasputin exists before the climax of the movie. There's no kind of relationship or conflict built between the two of them. And so the final confrontation ends up falling flat. We'll get to the climax later, unlike myself, but let's get back to Rasputin. There are two scenes in which Rasputin creates roadblocks for Anastasia before the final confrontation. The first is when he hijacks the train, the second is when he tries to get her to sleepwalk into the ocean. On one hand, these scenes do help the story by forcing Anastasia and Dmitri to work together and bond, and this adds to the romantic elements of the story. But on the other hand, these near-death experiences don't cause any sort of change or development in Anastasia. They just feel like brief action scenes that were tacked on so kids would have a good time. While the sleepwalking scene has a bit of characterization with Anastasia hallucinating her family, she doesn't really wrestle with this. She doesn't even think about it after this scene. So my question is, does Rasputin even need to be in this movie? Because even though he's framed as the villain, he's not the real villain here. The villain is just the situation. It's just Anastasia's struggle to get to her grandmother. I genuinely think that this movie would have been stronger without Rasputin. He doesn't provide a clear enough hurdle for Anastasia to jump over, and given his screen time, you'd think he has like so much to do with the plot, but he doesn't. He ends up being so unimportant in regards to theme, plot, character development, whatever. And there's some iffy undertones to his writing and design, but we'll get to that. It's time to talk about the climax, the worst part of the movie. So, for context, Rasputin lures Anastasia out onto a bridge and attacks her. He almost throws her off a bridge before Dmitri comes back and fights him. Anastasia eventually breaks the reliquary that ties Rasputin to this earth and sends him to hell. So a lot to go over. She barely reacts to the hedges trapping her. Before this moment, she has not seen magic, like, at all. And now it's specifically used in opposition to her, and she's kind of, like, mildly off-put by it. Once she gets out of there, she just kind of brushes it off. Bartok. God damn Bartok. He completely ruins the tone of the scene. The scene is supposed to be like dark and harrowing and all that jazz, and then Bartok comes in with his stupid voice and his jaunty little music cue.
You're on your own, sir. This can only end in tears.
I guess this is supposed to be his moment because he finally gives up on Rasputin, but I have a hard time buying it considering Rasputin doesn't even hear him. Why are you in this movie? I'm very confused as to what the threat is supposed to be here. So he's like trying to get her to fall into the water, but the bridge is not that high up. She could easily survive that. The only reasoning I can think is like, if she falls into the water, it's likely that like rubble will fall on her, but like that's not really given much consideration. Another thing is that he says this line.
Care for a little swim under the ice?
Terrible one-liner, but whatever. So like, maybe he wants to get her trapped under the ice, but plenty of the ice is broken, and so I don't know if that's really a threat. Maybe hypothermia? That seems like a weird execution method. I don't know. His method of killing her just really confuses me. Unless she can't swim, but then that's not established. Dmitri does absolutely nothing in this scene. The only part that can be inferred that he actually does something is when he like first comes back and like punches Rasputin because it's implied that he's gonna cast a spell on Anastasia, but it's not really given much weight. Also, what is this shot? This spell doesn't lead to anything, so why is it given so much focus? Also, this line.
We lived through this. Remind me to thank you.
Like, she's literally saying she's gonna thank him later. I know it's a callback to this scene.
We lived through this. Remind me to thank you.
And it actually made sense there, but here it just feels wrong. Back to the point, after this, Dmitri kind of helps Anastasia up, but like it's shown later that she was perfectly capable of climbing herself, and he's sidetracked soon after, so this Pegasus is such a weird inclusion. Its only purpose is to look cool and give Dmitri something to do. Though I do appreciate that Rasputin animated the mane and the tail. That's really fun. That's a fun detail. Dmitri just gets held up by the unnecessary Pegasus, so why was he here?
Oh, Anya!
On a similar note, Anastasia spends the majority of the scene just hanging from a ledge. While she does eventually end up defeating Rasputin by crushing the reliquary that ties him to the earth, which she has little to no reason to believe that that's what that will do, she is quite passive during this scene. And I'll break that part down later, but I'm just putting it out there. The dog is actually the most active agent in this scene. He bites Rasputin's leg to stop Rasputin from casting a spell on her, and he gets the reliquary for Anastasia. Hashtag Team Fart Dog. And this one doesn't exactly hinder the scene, but when Anastasia finally gets up and confronts Rasputin, she takes so much time after she makes her presence known to actually, like, tackle him. It's like, hurry up. Like, I don't actually think this is a problem with the scene. I've just watched it so many times that now I really notice it. There is zero reason for Dimitri to get knocked out. Like, there's a brief moment where she thinks he's dead, I think, and that doesn't lead to anything, though. Like, if you're gonna have a fake out character death, that has to lead to something, like a revelation. And I guess you can argue that she realizes she's in love with him, but I feel like that is reinforced by Dimitri just coming back and their interactions during the fight. I think my main problem with this scene is that even though it feels like the climax, it's not. The climax of the movie is when Anastasia and her grandmother finally reunite. And I think that's actually a really good scene. It's emotionally resonant and it feels very true. I think it's one of the strongest parts of the movie, even though they didn't set up the peppermint thing at all.
Peppermint?
But then after this scene, there's still 20 minutes left of the movie where we have to introduce Anastasia's struggle with aristocracy and bring Rasputin back into the picture. So again, the main problem with Anastasia and this scene is that the story ended when Anastasia and her grandmother reunited. But the scene happens at an hour 12, which is still technically feature length, but it's not really like a common length for a movie to be. And even if we look at this through the perspective of this is Dimitri's story, not Anastasia's, it makes a little bit more sense, the timing, because him returning to Anastasia is a good fitting end to his character arc. But again, he does nothing in the scene. And also, he has even less of a relationship to Rasputin than Anastasia. So again, Rasputin is just here for no reason. So this movie is like a 45 to 50 minute story stretched to an hour and a half long. I understand why they made these decisions with Rasputin, Bartok, and whatever. It's hard to market a kid's movie that doesn't have a villain or a comic relief character, an animal sidekick, or what have you. But I think they could have spent the time that they devoted to Rasputin and Bartok to developing Anastasia and her romance with Dimitri. I also think that the potential struggle brought up in the scene that I hate of Anastasia racking with aristocracy is a much stronger theme, because that theme actually involves critical thinking and a real examination of who Anastasia is, which would lead to some great character development. But the current theme as it stands, it's just, will Anastasia remember who she is? Will she reunite with her grandmother? That doesn't really provide too much internal conflict. And it's just there to keep the central premise together, which she shouldn't have been an amnesiac in the first place. I think it's an overused and lazy Hollywood plot device. And while it probably wouldn't have appealed to kids as much, I really do think it would have solved the storytelling issues and made it a much stronger movie overall. I also think it would have been a much stronger movie without Rasputin. There are other problems with the movie, such as expository dialogue, inconsistency with the accents, the fact that they seem to think that Dimitri is attractive, but I'm not going to get into those because they're minor. So now that I'm done ripping into a beloved kids movie, it's time to rip into the kids movie a bit more, a lot more, and move on to more controversial stuff. How about we start with So I've already discussed how I think Anastasia is an underwritten character, but it's clear that that was not the intention. This movie has feminist attitudes toward its lead character, but I want to make the case here that these are quite shallow. So the third wave of feminism started in the early 1990s. Is this a little bit too serious for a discussion of a kids movie that came out 24 years ago? Yes, but work with me. This wave of feminism sought to be different than previous waves by focusing on intersectionality and sex positivity. All around, it was looking to be more inclusive to queer women, women of color, sex workers, poor women, etc. And so with this new wave of feminism, many studios felt the pressure to adapt to the times. That's why from Disney, Belle, Jasmine, and Pocahontas, yes, the racial aspects were handled poorly, but we're talking about this from a gendered point of view right now, were written as these curious, strong-headed characters compared to previous ones. But they also received criticism, such as Belle and Jasmine yearning for adventure and a bigger life just to get married in the end. Or Pocahontas, where they were so scared of depicting a Powhatan woman wrong that they didn't depict her at all. And one of the biggest criticisms, particularly for the latter two, was the overt sexualization of them. There is something to be said here about the racial aspects, the fact that the two of the first brown princesses that there ever were very heavily sexualized, but that is a whole other discussion, but I've linked to a video by Cheyenne Lin that goes into the issue at depth. So watching Anastasia with the knowledge that Don Bluth directed this and knowing that Don Bluth was a specific competitor of Disney, I have to wonder if Anastasia was written to be a more feminist alternative to these other princesses. For one thing, she is at no point in the narrative sexualized, which is actually a very positive thing. For most of the movie, she's wearing very ill-fitting, raggy clothing, and even when she changes into more fitting clothing, she is depicted as glamorous and beautiful rather than sexy, so I actually think that was good on them for how they depicted her. But aside from that, this movie throws in all these feminist buzzwords and dog whistles to get you to feel like, oh, this is a feminist character, such as...
Right.
Ow!
She certainly has a mind of her own.
Ow! You broke my nose.
Men are such babies. You bought me a tent.
But here's the thing, class. Including feminist talking points is not necessarily being feminist. Now, there is no one way to correctly be feminist. It is such a broad and all-encompassing term that if you try, there's certainly one subset of feminism that isn't going to feel included by it. And to that point, no movie has the obligation to be #feminist. But it's clear that this movie is trying to be feminist, or at least trying to appeal to feminists by making Anastasia this smart, spunky, outspoken woman. The main problem with this is something we've already touched upon, that Anastasia is not the main character of this story. Dmitri is. Dmitri is the character in the movie that grows the most, and his arc is what defines the narrative. Meanwhile, Anastasia does make decisions and take some action, no doubt, a big one being her choice to go to St. Petersburg, but was that really presented as anything but extremely obvious? And also, it's more the dog that convinces her to go to St. Petersburg, because he's the most competent character in this movie. But most of the plot happens because someone, Dmitri, is doing something for her. Dmitri gets her on the train. Dmitri saves her from falling off the boat. Dmitri is the one who sets up the meeting with Anastasia. Dmitri is the one who comes back to rescue her. He's even the one with a more feminist character arc, learning to see Anastasia as a whole person rather than just a pawn in his scheme. And I will repeat that it's not an inherent problem with the script that Dmitri is a more developed character. But when this movie is throwing in all these feminist dog whistles just to sideline its main female lead, there's a dissonance there between intention and impact. There's this one scene that bothers me a lot. So on the train, it has been sabotaged, and Dmitri has the idea to hook a chain to the car to try to stop it from moving. And so he asks Vladimir to hand him the rest of the chain, but he falls in a box, so Anastasia has to take over.
Vlad's busy at the moment.
It's a small moment, it shouldn't bother me as much as it does, but it just feels like a lazy empowerment moment where this dude is occupied for no reason, and so the woman has to take over, #girlboss. It feels less like she's being proactive and helpful, and more like the writers just wanted to appeal to the feminists. There's even a scene a few moments earlier that works pretty well because Vladimir has nothing to do with it. So they're trying to uncouple the car from the engine so that they stop moving, and they're trying all these methods, and Anastasia comes up with the idea to use dynamite. Even though, again, it's the dog who comes up with the idea for the dynamite. God, why did they give him all this agency? Why did they give fucking Fart Dog all of this competency and agency that they couldn't give to Anastasia? Oh, that feels like a whole can of worms. But even so, it at least treats Anastasia as more of a competent character and that she's good at creative problem solving. And I really wish there were more scenes like this because it really would have developed her as a character so much more. It also treats Anastasia's feminism in opposition to Dmitri. Like, we have to prove that she's better than him. But this is really only done on paper because, once more, Dmitri is a much more developed character than Anastasia. And to top it all off, it just ends up with them getting eloped. Now, having characters get married in the end of the movie is not an anti-feminist choice to make. It's a valid choice depending on the movie you're making. But one, their romance wasn't developed not nearly enough. And two, them getting married in the end just reinforces the heteronormativity that Disney movies had set. So it doesn't feel any more feminist than these other Disney movies that had come out. I know that Disney gets criticism for how quickly its leads get married in the movies, but like, this is the only movie I've seen where it's explicit that they get married like a month after meeting. So that's about that for feminism. Solve feminism in Disney movies, y'all. Actually, Fox. But now it's time to talk about how Anastasia is depicted not just as a woman, but as a person. And also the exploitation of her story for financial gain. But first, a history lesson. Anastasia Nikolaevna was the youngest daughter of the last Tsar of Russia and a member of the Romanov family. After the Russian Revolution, the entire family tried to go into exile in both the UK and France, but was denied both times. They were subsequently put into house arrest at their estate in Tsarskaya Sela, modern-day Pushkin. While they were taken care of, their movement was extremely regulated. Soon after, due to concerns about protests growing in St. Petersburg, possibly bleeding into Tsarskaya Sela, the entire family was moved to Tobolsk, a remote town in Siberia. They lived in relative comfort and luxury until the Bolsheviks reduced the subsidy that the state was granting them, meaning they had to give up their servants. Not long after, Red Guards from 2 different areas arrived in Tobolsk to exert their power over the area. This led to fighting and the eventual removal of the Tsar, his wife Alexandra, and the second youngest daughter Maria from Tobolsk to Yekaterinburg. Anastasia stayed in Tobolsk for another month with her sisters Olga and Tatiana and her younger brother Alexei, who at the time was not in a condition to move. In Yekaterinburg, they were basically prisoners. While before they had servants and rights to walk about the grounds, here they were kept under very strict schedules and regulation. During most of the time, Nikolai was awaiting trial, but the trial never happened. This was because the Soviet Union was going through a civil war, and bringing Nikolas to Moscow, which was now the capital, was extremely dangerous due to all the protests and the war. Because of this, it was decided that it was more efficient and simpler to execute the family before the army could arrive to Yekaterinburg. There's a lot of political stuff that went on during this that led to this, but if I included it, this video would become like 800 hours long, so we're not going to dive into it here. So I'm going to get into semi-graphic detail about the nature of the Romanovs' death, so if you are sensitive to that, be warned. So there is no agreed upon story for how the execution took place, but this is what is considered the most logical series of events based on what I found. Oh, God. On July 17th, 1918, between midnight and 2 a.m., the Romanov family was awakened by their physician who was claiming to be moving them to a safer location due to the approaching armies. They were moved into a small basement where Nikolas requested chairs for his wife and his son. They were granted this. After a few minutes, a troop of secret police came in, and a Bolshevik named Yurov Yurovsky stated this.
Nikolai Alexandrovich, in view of the fact that your relatives are continuing their attack on Soviet Russia, the Ural executive community has decided to execute you.
Obviously, the entire family panicked and protested, but at this point there wasn't really anything they could do. So Yurovsky shot Nikolas, another Bolshevik named Pyotr Ermakov shot Alexandra, and the rest of the firing squad shot randomly into the room. Despite the number of shots fired, none of the children died in this initial round of bullets, with Maria having just simply been injured on her leg. This is largely attributed to their clothing, which had diamonds and other fine gems sewn into it. Due to the noise levels waking most civilians nearby, they resorted to using bayonets and gun butts to execute the children. Their deaths were all excessive, violent, and inhumane, and I won't be describing them here. Their bodies were moved to a nearby forest called Kopyatki, where their bodies were stripped, dumped into a shallow mine, and covered in sulfuric acid to maim the bodies beyond recognition. The bodies were moved after it was decided that the mine was too shallow to hide them. During this process, it was decided that Alexei and one of the daughters would be moved from the others to cause confusion if people tried to find them. But because of the sulfuric acid, it was quite unclear which of the daughters it was. Either way, the Tsar, Tsarina, and 3 of the daughters were buried in another mine. Alexei and the other daughters' bodies were burned and their bones were smashed. This decision is what ultimately led to the belief that Anastasia survived her execution, even though the body was most likely Maria, but this is not definitively proven. Their remains were discovered in 2007, a decade after this film's release. So to an extent, the release of this movie makes sense. Nobody knows what happened to this last Romanov daughter. Is she still alive? Where could she be? It's filled with drama, to the point that multiple people claim to be her. And at the time of this movie's release, the last daughter hadn't been found. There is this mysticism around the person Anastasia could have been. People around the world were fascinated with her and the Romanovs in a way they weren't even fascinated with the French or English monarchy. And so it makes sense that they would turn this into like a fairy tale movie. But it's also reasonable to argue that they are taking this really bloody and violent time in Russian history, a time of horrible unrest, and turning into a fun kids movie for the whole family to enjoy. This movie is about Anastasia in name only. Anything having to do with Russian history is basically gone by the time the title card shows up. So I guess my question is, Did this movie even need to be about Anastasia? For marketing purposes, it makes sense. People were fascinated by this story, and so if you make a movie about it, it's bound to get some butts in seats. But from storytelling perspective, it's completely unnecessary and easily written around. And there is the argument to be made that this crosses a line into exploitation. They're taking this girl's name, her tragedy, and turning it into a kids movie that they can sell to audiences for financial gain. And there's also little to no acknowledgement of the actual circumstances. But on the other hand, there's also an argument that this movie could encourage people to learn more about Russian history and about the Romanovs. You know, even descendants of the Romanovs have accepted this movie and other retellings of Anastasia as historical fantasy, and that as long as it's clear that it is historical revisionism, there's no problem with it. And you can also say that this movie takes the story of a young girl dying tragically and gives her a happy ending. It gives her a life she could have lived, and there's something positive in that too. It provides another life that Anastasia could have lived, free from the trauma and the pain she experienced. And it's interesting to note that the reception in Russia is actually quite positive, with many accepting the movie as historical fantasy rather than a historically accurate tale. I wanted to add a section here where I gave anecdotes from Russian people about what they thought of the movie, but I don't have the clout for that just yet, so maybe we'll do that in another video. I don't know. Web designer and Russian history enthusiast Bob Atchison said this in an article in the New York Times.
If 900,000 kids go to Anastasia, and of that, 10,000 kids become really interested in Russian history and go on to find the truth and pursue it, it's worth it. But on the other hand, we create 890,000 people in the United States who are actually going to believe the story is true.
So this is a complicated issue with multiple valid points on either side, so I don't think it's entirely appropriate to decide here and now whether this movie crosses the line into exploitation or not. I just think it's important to bring up everything. Y'all can decide for yourselves. So that was dark. And we're not about to stop with the dark shit, because now it's time for... more history time, y'all. Okay, so for brevity's sake, I'm going to just be going over the broad strokes of everything I'm going to be describing here, but it is actually much more complicated than I could ever explain in this video. So just keep that in mind. So before Nikolas came into power, his father Alexander was the Tsar, and he was considered not a good person and also a huge anti-Semite, because you can't really go through history without finding at least one anti-Semite in power. But he was considered a very diplomatic and powerful leader, considering there were no wars fought during his time and there was significant growth within Russia. So while the common people, the Jews, and the indigenous Russians were not exactly thrilled with him, the more affluent, i.e. powerful and rich Russian people were. Then comes Nikolas, and everything goes downhill. So to start off with, at the celebration for his coronation, 1,300 plus people died because there was worry that there wasn't going to be enough food. People got trampled to death and many, many more got injured. This was considered a bad omen, and rightfully so, because you have no idea what's to come. In February 1904, Russia and Japan entered a war over a land dispute in Manchuria. Now, there are so many complicated issues as to why this was happening, but the big point here is that Russia was losing badly. And they were losing so badly despite having a larger army, and many cite the distance between St. Petersburg and Manchuria as a reason for this. But that's not even the worst part. Soldiers were dying left and right. Japan was winning by a landslide, but Nikolas refused to acknowledge this. He knew what was happening, but he deluded himself into thinking that the war was being won, or that the war was going to be won. And because of that, he absolutely refused to concede to Japan despite how many heavy losses they were taking. This refusal to concede led to widespread criticism both from Russian citizens and allies. From 1903 to 1906, various anti-Semitic riots happened throughout Russia that led to the death of many Jewish people, in particular children. And while the government and the church both condemned the riots, in private, Nikolas actually considered them to be a good thing because he considered anti-Semitism to be a good unifier. In 1905, a labor leader named Georgy Gabon led a march of workers to hand a petition to Nikolas. During their march, they were repeatedly stopped and diverted by Russian soldiers who eventually ended up open firing on them, killing 92. Meanwhile, Nikolas was in Tsarskaya Sela, completely removed from the situation, later remarking this in his diary.
Difficult day. In St. Petersburg, there were serious disturbances due to the desire of workers to get to the Winter Palace. The troops had to shoot in different places of the city. There were many dead and wounded. Lord, how painful and bad.
This again drew criticism from Russian citizens and people outside of Russia. In 1905, again, various uprisings, protests, and strikes were happening across Russia due to growing unrest about the autocratic regime. They were demanding higher wages and the right to unionize, which wasn't an option under the Tsar's rule. While Nikolas tried to quell the revolution with a manifesto, many key details that the protesters were demanding were left out, and thus the protests continued. Various protests and strikes happened throughout Russia, particularly in the Caucasus regions, Moscow, and St. Petersburg, for almost entirely a year, from December 1904 to December 1905. Nikolas was hesitant to make concessions, with one of the bigger concessions he made was the formation of the Duma. The Duma was an advisory party for Nikolas. Eventually, the October Manifesto was written, which agreed to most of the terms set by the protesters, including basic civil rights, the formation of political parties, expanding voting rights, and making the Duma the central legislative body. Nikolas reluctantly signed, and after presenting the manifesto, the protests mostly died, with the last of them being quelled just a few months later. Russia remained fairly quiet for the next few years until World War I. Nikolas decided to enter World War I despite it not involving them, being grossly underprepared, and most of the population being completely opposed to it. Just like with the Russo-Japanese War, Russia took severe losses, including losing Poland to Germany. He ignored or was simply ignorant to the demands of his people, and many of them went hungry. He spent most of his time at the front lines, away from his country, so as a result, unrest grew, and resentment grew and grew. And the dynasty started falling. After all of this, finally, in February of 1917, the Russian Empire fell. So why am I bringing up all these examples of why Nikolas was a terrible ruler? Because Anastasia has a weird relationship with Nikolas, the Russian Empire, the Russian Revolution, the Soviet Union, and Rasputin. Speaking of Rasputin, it's this culturally accepted thing that Rasputin was the reason the Russian Empire fell, that he is the sole reason. When in reality, the empire had been on the decline for a decade before Rasputin even showed up in St. Petersburg. This isn't to say that Rasputin didn't contribute or that he wasn't a horrible person. He was an opportunist and a rapist. But to use him as a scapegoat when there are so many other reasons why Russia fell, particularly due to Nikolas's negligence and stupidity, it's kind of irresponsible. But because it's accepted that Russia fell because of Rasputin, this movie subscribes to that too. It puts all the blame on him. The Russian Revolution, Rasputin. The execution of the Romanovs, Rasputin. When there's two things very wrong with this. One, he wasn't even alive during the February Revolution. He was executed the year before, I think. And two, this movie says in the beginning that he was exiled due to treason when he remained good friends with the Romanovs, particularly Alexandra, up until his execution. I say execution, but it was an assassination. Nikolas never wisened up to Rasputin's insidiousness. He was just as entranced with him as his wife was, who was maybe or maybe not sleeping with him. Who knows? There is no historical basis for it, but I like to believe it's true because I think it's funny. And also, I highly doubt that an illiterate, homeless, mentally ill holy man would be able to topple an entire monarchy. I mean, I'd love to see that happen, but I doubt it would. But this movie really wants us to treat Rasputin as the sole bad guy, right down to the character design. He looks really different from the rest of them, doesn't he? Why is that? Let's take a look. Well, here's some controversy for you. Rasputin here is pretty much coded as Arab, Central Asian, South Asian, basically any brown person because they're all the same, you know. The beard he has is very reminiscent of Jafar's in Aladdin. His skin is quite a bit darker than the rest of them. His eyes are yellow, for Christ's sake. This problem isn't isolated to this movie, though. Coding a villain as darker skinned is something across animation. Scar is a famous example. But I think it's important to note that this is another case of a character being designated as ethnically ambiguous, so we see them as the other and therefore evil. And you know, this is an insidious practice because it teaches us to view the other as evil. So Rama Rasputin was very much done dirty in this movie, not because he was secretly a kind, charitable, amazing person who was viciously defamed post-mortem, but because he was treated as the sole reason that the Russian Empire fell, when that is very far from the case. And while he doesn't appear in the movie much, Nikolas is framed as this loving, doting father and a magnanimous ruler, which he was not. Well, he might have been a loving father, but definitely not to Anastasia. She was his fourth daughter after trying for years for a son. He didn't like her very much. So this movie frames Nikolas as good and worthy, and as a result, it frames the people of Russia as irrational and vindictive for the revolution, rather than being tired of being treated as second class and being let to starve in the streets. Even worse, it just treats them as puppets in Rasputin's scheme, taking away their agency. So this brings us to the weird way that the movie depicts the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union. Take a look at this shot. What does this shot mean? Well, here's what I got from it. The Church of Savior on Spilled Blood was constructed between 1887 and 1907 during the late Russian Empire. It is a symbol of that time, and it's breaking the cloud cover, so it gives it this holy, ethereal look. We're supposed to register this as beautiful, right? No, my titty's not out. And then we move under the cloud cover and see the dark, gray, industrial place that St. Petersburg has become, and we're obviously supposed to register this as ugly compared to the Church of Savior on Spilled Blood. It's a very stark contrast, and from a purely filmmaking standpoint, it's actually quite good. It gets its message across well. But what is the message? So the majority of this movie takes place during the early Soviet years when Russia started rapidly industrializing. But this movie holds on to the romanticism of pre-Soviet Russia, contrasting the beauty of the palace before with the derelict and ugly state of it now. There's a very clear bias in this movie towards traditionalism and the aesthetics of the Russian Empire over the Soviet Union. But to be clear, the Russian Empire was an autocratic regime. It was a monarchy. So I can't help but be put off by the weird way that this movie seems to support monarchy, imperialism, autocracy. I know that it was more about the aesthetics, that there's something very beautiful about, monarchy, but industrialization is not as beautiful as that. But even still, it's an odd stance for this movie to take, considering how horrible the quality of life was before the February Revolution. Maybe for the royals, it was fantastic. Definitely for the royals, it was fantastic, because they didn't exist, the Soviet Union. But for everybody else, it wasn't. Now, I'm not here to say that the Soviet Union was perfect and non-corrupt, because it categorically wasn't. But there is a specific reason why it formed. It's not just that the people were puppets of Rasputin, it's because the regime had consistently treated them as disposable, second class, and let them starve in the streets. And it reinforces this traditionalist mindset with the rest of the movie too. This whole movie is the desperate attempt to leave industrialized Russia and get to Paris, which is a more classically beautiful place. It's also more Western. And again, I'm not saying the Soviet Union was a perfect system, but France wasn't either. So to treat France as this beautiful, luxurious, artistic place and then treat St. Petersburg as ugly, desolate, horrible, it has a very anti-Eastern agenda, and so it seems kind of insulting to Eastern Europe, Russia, and even Asia as a whole. And again, this movie is not the only property that ascribes to this. We have this fascination with the Romanovs. They are considered martyrs by many, and while the children should definitely not be burdened with the atrocities that Nikolas committed, it's irresponsible to treat the Romanovs as simply tragic figures when there are so many reasons that they fell. So this movie just cops to the notion that Rasputin is the only reason that Russia fell and the Soviet Union sucks donkey dick. And while it's not surprising or new, it makes it somewhat frustrating to watch. Wow, that was a lot. How do I get out of this? Let's just not try. So this is a more familiar setting, right? I dolled it up a little bit because last time Hassan made fun of me. I'm filming this section after I've basically edited all of the footage, and I'm really happy about it. I'm really excited about how it's turned out. Even though I know it's going to, I really hope it doesn't flop because... But, it has been 4 months. You have every right to not watch this video. Despite everything I've said here, I actually still really enjoy Anastasia. I think it's a fun kids movie, and it has a good adventure. It has problems with the way it depicts things like feminism, Russian history, character development, basic storytelling structure, but ultimately it ends up working. And I really think this has to do with the animation, which really is some of the best that came out of the 90s. And so I want to again praise the animators for doing an amazing job on this movie. I say this to hammer in the point that you are allowed to enjoy Anastasia, or any movie ever, really. This is my attempt to hammer in a theme for this video at the last minute. But I think it's somewhat a mistake to watch a movie, especially one based on real events, and just take it at face value. There's a phrase that's been making the rounds for a while on Twitter, YouTube, etc. of let people enjoy things. And while the sentiment of that I agree with, I think it is ultimately a somewhat naive and reductive way to view art, because this can sometimes warrant a weird reaction where people act like you can't criticize media that they enjoy. And this is just such a naive way to experience art. Art is about the push and pull between auteurs and critics. You know, auteurs, they make the art, then the critics critique the art, and the auteurs take that criticism and apply it to their next project, and the cycle begins anew. This is the essence of art. If we don't critique art, it doesn't improve. And while I agree that mean-spirited and hyperbolic criticism needs to be reined in, good faith criticism is actually a very good thing. I want to say that I had a very good reason for wanting to talk about Anastasia, but it's more just that I had a lot to say about it. But also, I've seen many Disney princesses go through so many stages of criticism where they were hailed as progressive at their time, and then later on they became anti-feminist, and then back to progressive again, and now they're finally reaching a more nuanced place. But I haven't really seen Anastasia reevaluated like this, and so I wanted to throw my hat into the ring. I ascribe to the Anita Sarkeesian school of thinking. It is both possible and even necessary to simultaneously enjoy media while also being critical of its more problematic or pernicious aspects. So while I do enjoy Anastasia, I think it would be a mistake for me to just ignore the aspects about it that make me uncomfortable. But that's about it. God, that took a long time, and it got really dark. I didn't intend for it to, it just kind of happened. So I'm done talking about Anastasia, so if that's all you came for, you can click away, but I do want to talk about me, this channel, and my motives for just a bit. Most people who are subscribed to me at the moment subscribe because of my Aaron Taylor Johnson video, and you know, you have no idea how grateful I am to all of you for that. I spent a really long time on that. I spent a long time researching, and the fact that it blew up as much as it did made me so happy, because not only do I now have an audience, but, you know, it seems like a conversation is getting started on YouTube. Here's the thing, though. While I am proud of that video and glad about the attention it got, it's not really what I intended my channel to be. If you can tell from this video, I wanted this to be more about film analysis. And it's not like I plan to do no videos similar to the Aaron Taylor Johnson one in the future, but I'm planning on balancing it more with film analysis. So sometimes you'll get film analysis, sometimes you'll get like exposing Hollywood corruption or whatever. But also, I'm not going to be doing another video about grooming. I know some people want me to, but at the moment, I have said what I want to about grooming, and I feel like if I were to continue down that path, it'd become redundant and I'd become like a tea channel, and that's really not what I want to be. But I just want to be transparent and say that videos like my Aaron Taylor Johnson video are not going to be the only ones this channel makes. So if that's all you came for, I am sorry to disappoint, but I really hope you'll stick around, because I have some cool ideas for videos in the future, because I am absolutely eternally grateful for everyone who liked, commented, subscribed, or even just watched the video, even the homophobes and the other bigots, because hey, that video is now 1.3 million views and I have almost 25,000 subscribers, so see, homophobes can be good for a couple things. God, the amount of people who thought I was being dismissive of my audience because I said I had 11 subscribers when I literally did only have 11 subscribers when I posted that video. I'm just too iconic and y'all can't handle that. Shout out to my one patron, Daniel Graves, who about a month ago decided to break up with me, which, fair enough, it has been 4 months. Despite that, I hope you'll consider supporting my Patreon, because if I get enough patrons, I can, you know, start doing this more regularly and maybe get more regular content. Although I will try to not wait 4 months before posting another video. I'm sorry. Also, if there are any nerds in the audience, my friend and roommate is doing a D&D game a la The Bachelorette, where it's like dating game rules. It's It sounds kind of weird, but it's actually pretty fun. I've been doing some of the production work, and it's pretty fun. So if you're interested in that, I will link her channel below. But that's pretty much it. Thank you. Like and subscribe. Good night.